right, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming on early. Hope everyone's having a good lunch, but also has their notes, ready to take notes. If you guys could help me out, and I just want to check if you guys can see the screen, can see me, can hear me. Just type a number 1 into the chat if everything's all good. You can see and hear me. Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Ellen, Kelly, Carlos, Apri. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone else. We got 2 minutes left, so we're just going to hang out here for a little bit. But in the meantime, I'd like to ask you guys a question about your business. So if you guys can share, what business are you in? Are you a hair salon? Are you a software company? Do you create apps? What kind of company are you in, so that we can tailor the presentation and the speaker can tailor the presentation to your business. So that way we can get even more specific and talk to you directly. Not to mention that it's always great to know what someone else on this watching the same webinar is doing. I'm a big proponent of networking. You never know where you're going to find your next partner. So would love you guys to share a little bit of that. Web development, online marketing, cool. Honey company. Awesome. So you produce honey products. I don't know what to say with honey products, but that's very cool. Queen-honey. Awesome. Technology consulting, commercial maintenance and repairs, IT consulting, that's huge. Senior living consultant. Awesome. Marine sales and service. Awesome. And like I said, feel free to network with each other here. You just never know. Materials engineering research company. Awesome. Thank you everyone for sharing that. So it's 12 p.m. So we're gonna get started. For everyone that just came in, thank you so much for joining us. This is NJ Thrives Thursdays, a weekly webinar series for New Jersey small business owners. I'm your host, Christian Pichardo, NJSBDC marketing consultant and CEO of nilumamedia.com. And the NJSBDC, or America's New Jersey Small Business Development Centers Network, that's a mouthful. It's basically a statewide program that's powered by the SBA and partners, and we help small businesses in New Jersey with no-cost small business consulting, training and events starting at $0, and exclusive small business resources only available to clients. So our agenda is always, we start with a few headlines, small business headlines. We get into the webinar, and after the webinar, we'll get into Q&A. So here are some headlines that I'd like to go over with you guys. So the Build Back Better agenda, providing greater tax fairness to small businesses. So it looks like our government's going to work out some type of program to give us more, to give us small business. I'm also a small business owner, so to give us better tax advantages as a small business. So that's always good to hear, right? right? The government giving back to small business. So I'm not going to go over the entire article here, but this is a great resource. We drop all the links of the articles into the chat, so you can go ahead and save those for later. But that's one of the things that came out today, actually. So super exciting. Next is, we're in less than 2 weeks, the PPP program. They've accepted more than 340,000 submissions. So you might want to check into that. Maybe you were one of the people who got approved. So again, one of those articles where it's just a reminder, check out in your email somewhere where it says that you got approved, right? That could be great news for today. But those are our 2 headlines for today. Before we get into the webinar, 3 things to keep in mind is 1, type your questions into the Q&A box. So on the bottom of your screen, there's a little toolbar with a bunch of icons. There's one that says Q&A. Would love for you to ask questions in there so that we could sort of have a running list in one area. And you could also ask anonymously. So that's a great feature. Number 2 is completing a 3-minute survey after this webinar. So once this webinar is over, you're going to get sent a survey. Once you complete that survey, you're going to get access to the presentation materials of our speaker, and in about 48 hours, it'll be live for you to watch later. And number 3 is, by joining this event, you're automatically eligible for an Upgrade Your Business certificate. More details at the link there. We'll drop it into the chat. But without further ado, today's event is with Michelle Schaap. It's a blueprint for small business cybersecurity. So how you doing, Michelle?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Awesome,
and
awesome.
As we're getting ready to start, I'm going to ask you if you will allow me to start sharing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you see that?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. For those of you who've been at my prior Lunch and Learns on Thursdays, you know that in the past, I focused on what you're preparing for, what laws are out there, and what have you. Today, I'm specifically focusing on how to prepare for the when. If you're looking for information about those other topics, as Christian mentioned, my prior presentations are recorded, and presumably future presentations will be recorded. Also, I greatly appreciate you giving feedback, because then I know if the content I've provided to you is in fact value add, whether I need to make changes, whether I'm speaking too quickly, too slowly, whether the slides are too much, too little. So please do share the feedback. And I will tell you that my slides do tend to be content packed, so that when you get the presentation materials afterwards, you can go back and refer to them. And I will tell you in particular, an area where my slides are very content heavy, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it today, is cyber insurance and crime coverage. So that if you have questions about cyber insurance and crime coverage and what you should be looking out for in terms of how to prepare, that information is towards the back of the slide deck that you'll be receiving, and please use that as a resource. Now, let's jump into this. And of course, no presentation is going to be complete without me giving a legal disclaimer. I am here as a resource. By all means, please feel free to consider retaining my services, but this is a, if you will, generic presentation. Although, Christian, I have to thank you for asking our audience what businesses they're in, because as we discuss how to prepare, depending upon the nature of your business, it's a very different conversation. So a lot of you are B2B, and the advantage, if you will, of being B2B when it comes to cybersecurity and risk is that you tend to have more business information and not personal information. I saw that at least one person was a seamstress, and by the way, I would love to get your contact information, but I will tell you that you, probably more than any of our other participants today, have more personally identifiable information. And so when we think about how we prepare and what's at risk, you need to identify in the first instance what you're protecting. Then you need to assess your risk. Once you've identified risk, then you need to mitigate, remediate, or decide, in fact, you're going to accept risk, which is also an option. Then you want to be able to detect when, in fact, somebody, God forbid, has gotten into your environment, and how do you recover? Now, these 5 steps I did not come up with myself. And in fact, one of the resources you'll see at the end of the presentation is from NIST. And NIST identifies these 5 basic steps when we're thinking about cyber risk and response. In terms of what you're preparing, and I put it in somewhat of an inverse order, your incident response plan. When we think about incidents and events, you need to know if and when the God forbid happens, how are you going to respond? Now, what I have, and I don't know if you guys can see this, and probably not, and I'm more than happy to share it afterwards. Christian's trying to just peer into my screen. This little handy dandy index card is laminated. I also have a foldable version that can go into a wallet. Every single person in my office gets this card. And I will tell you, on the left side of the column issues, it says issue, lost device, cyber incident, suspected breach, contact from client or law enforcement, lost file compromise, and a few other items. And then it says, who in the office do you call? Because these things are not going to happen conveniently. And if you have your incident response plan on your computer and you're hit by ransomware, lots of luck getting that incident response plan. And again, if you've got employees who are working remotely, these things often happen Friday at 4:45. They'll happen on 4th of July. So you want them to be able to figure out who they're reporting to and how. In terms of what you're doing, again, you need to consider assets, personnel. And again, when we think about breaches, it's not just technology, it's also physical environment, and thinking again about what you've committed to vis-a-vis your customers. And for those of you that are B2B, the odds are good that at a minimum, you've got non-disclosure agreements. And in fact, I'll share with you, I'm in the midst of advising a client in a merger and acquisition deal. They are acquiring a smaller business. And last month, the business was hit by a ransom attack.
Oh, no.
We had an all hands call yesterday. And in the course of the discussion, I asked the potential target and their attorney, have you reviewed your contracts in terms of any type of reporting obligation in connection with this attack? And by the way, the attack did not involve personally identifiable information. It did involve business information about their customers. And they said, well, we don't have a reporting obligation under the statutes. I said, but do you have a reporting obligation under your contracts? And they hadn't gone back and looked at those agreements to see what did they commit to in terms of letting people know if these things happened. And by the way, that should be part of your incident response plan. So for my firm's incident response plan, we have pages that talk about what happens if there's wire fraud. We have pages that talk about what happens if there's a stolen device. But we also have a tab for the list of our clients that contractually we have to give notice if their business has been compromised, including the points of contact for those business owners, the time frame that we have to tell them, because some of our clients say we want to know in 24 hours. And if that's not part of your incident response plan, you could be breaching your contract while you're busy trying to deal with the oh my gods. So having that already laid out, and we'll get into that later in the conversation, is critical. And again, these things should not be stored on your computer because it may be the computer that has been compromised. When you think about how you're preparing, think about, for those of us that went through, for example, Irene, Superstorm Sandy, your businesses may or may not have had generators. Well, if you didn't have a generator, how are you running your business? And think about a cyber event. What do you need to run your business if you can't access your computer, if you can't access your CRM system, if you can't contact your clients through the internet? How are you going to keep the lights on? And when we think about how we're preparing, that's what you want to be thinking about. What do I need to be in business after the proverbial happens? So let's go back to the beginning of the process, those 5 steps. Assets. We need to understand what we are protecting. You've got financial assets, whether it be banking information. You've got informational assets, information about your personnel. You've got your reputation, which, trust me, you don't want that tarnished. We all know your mother always told you you have one opportunity to make that first good impression. People know that these things happen, but even though they know it, are they going to come back to you if in fact it had happened? And I want to share with you, as we go through this conversation, a few war stories as we go along. So one of my clients is a major utility. The major utility has a lot of vendors, large and small. We are actually preparing to do a presentation where I'm going to be one of the panelists with in-house attorneys at this major utility. We were about to have a conference call to prepare for the panel, and I happened to see in the news one of their vendors had a data breach. Now, I know that there was one of their vendors because I actually wrote the contract with the vendor. And I said to in-house counsel, by the way, did you hear from so-and-so? And they said, no, I read about it in the news. That vendor just lost trust with a major client, because now the major client says, okay, if you didn't tell me about this attack and I had to read about it in the news, what aren't you telling me? Don't undervalue the risk to your reputation that a cyber event could create. You've got operations, you've got administrative resources that you may or may not be able to access after a compromise, you've got systems. All of these things are part of your assets that you're thinking about when you're putting together a roadmap to protecting your business and making sure you have business continuity. I alluded to Superstorm Sandy, same thing. You need to, do I have a generator? Okay, do I have my list of clients printed out? Do I have a list of my personnel written out? Do I know how to reach my personnel if I can't email them at mshap@csglaw.com? Do I know how to reach Christian if I can't email him at christian@sbdc.org? Is there an alternative point of contact if something has happened? So we need to think about our assets, and we also need to think about the equipment that that asset may be stored on. And particularly since COVID, where we've got people who are working remotely, who's controlling those assets? So are your people working on company issued devices? Are they working on home printers? Are they working on personal cell phones, or are they company issued cell phones? And the reason that these things matter is because these things all store data. So I was actually just in ShopRite this morning, and I don't know if it's still there or not, but it used to be at my local ShopRite that there was a bin where you could deposit your cell phone and donate it to charity. Well, if somebody does that with a device that has company information on it, and they haven't wiped the data from that device before they pop it into the donation bin, have the assets on that cell phone been wiped before that donation happened? When we think about home printers, the best way to make sure that a home printer is not storing company business after its use, first of all, obviously read the manual. And those manuals, if you've lost yours, is available online. But most home printers will wipe data if you turn them off at night. Computers, you need to know if you've got people working remotely, is it an environment that you're controlling? How are those systems going to be patched when we get into remediation? If you're not controlling those devices that your people are working on, how do you know that they have antivirus software installed? How do you know whether they've changed passwords on home routers? So if you haven't invested in company issued devices, and I know these are small businesses that we're speaking with, it's something that you may want to think about. But again, you need to know where they are and who controls them. And by the way, if you lease any of your equipment and you return equipment at the end of a lease, do not assume that the leasing company is going to wipe the data for you. Contractually, you may have negotiated that they will, but otherwise it's your responsibility to make sure that you've wiped the data from leased equipment before you return it or before you donate it, or before you do it as a sell to your personnel program. Some companies will offer company laptops at a discount to personnel or give it away. If there's still sensitive data on those devices, think about what you're doing with them.
A quick question, Michelle. From your experience, what are some assets or equipment that run that risk that most people might not think they would?
One of the things that I often talk about that freaks out people is your car. So a lot of people sync up their cell phone with their car.
Right.
When I leased a car, I guess it was now 3 or 4 years ago, and I went to sync my phone and I called up what you need to do on I don't even know what the screen is called on your car interface to do that. And it's already populated with phone numbers.
Yep.
And I'm thinking, okay, those aren't my phone numbers. Whose phone numbers are these? It was the prior owner of my car, or the prior lessor, or lessee rather, of my car, whose information was still on there. Now, first of all, I felt like a voyeur. But second of all, now let's suppose I happen to see, oh, that's interesting. That says the CEO of this company. I didn't have their cell phone number before. Now I've got it.
Yeah.
You never know where these things are going to be. And also, again, remember that it's not just about where it's stored on equipment. It could be paper. So when we think about boxes that are in your office, especially if you're not in your office now, and you've got cleaning crew still coming in, or the pest control crew still coming in, can they go into your office, open up file cabinets, and take things away that you're not thinking about? In terms of the intangible assets that we need to be protecting, again, we're talking about trademarks, patents, information, and it's not just yours. Some of the folks that are attending today said that they are commercial marketing consultants. Think about this. One of my clients is a marketing firm. They prepare all sorts of programs for launching new brands for their clients. They have very sensitive information before it's available in the public. So let's suppose that they were launching, I think there's a new Coca-Cola product out there that's new Coke Zero or whatever it is. And let's suppose that my client was working on that campaign. They know the brand. They know when the campaign's going to launch. They know who's involved with the campaign. If that information got out, we're not talking about personally identifiable information, but we're talking about competitive information. Yep. And Pepsi would want to know when that new Coke product was being released. Be very mindful of. And by the way, something else to think about, especially as a small business owner. A lot of small business owners want to include on their websites representative clients. You all remember the Target hack? Well, the Target HVAC vendor, which was the point of entry for Target's compromise, nobody cared about the HVAC vendor. No disrespect to HVAC vendors. What they cared about was that the HVAC vendor listed on his website who his customers were. So the bad actor said, I don't need to compromise Target. I've got my one-stop shopping at their HVAC vendor. And once the HVAC vendor was compromised, it was the entree into much bigger fish. So think about not only your assets, but your customers' assets. And again, we talked about, I'm sorry, what, Christian?
Sorry, but would you say also your vendors, it seems like could be a road to you?
Absolutely. And that's part of how we'll talk about responding to risk as we get further into discussion, is vetting your vendors and understanding which vendors are touching what. And at risk of getting ahead of myself, Christian, since you asked, think about the cleaning crew. And I was talking to one of my clients several years ago. I went in to do a lunch and learn for them. Small law firm in the Lehigh Valley, probably had about a total of 60 employees. And they generally worked 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. And I asked them, when do your computers log out? When do they time out? And they said 2 hours. Now, I will tell you, 2 hours is an eternity. That means that the computer that I'm working on right now to present to you is left up and live for 2 hours. Now, let's suppose that that 2-hour window is not in my home where I'm working from right now, but instead in my office. And I leave my office at 5 o'clock for a meeting and I don't shut down my computer. And now the cleaning crew comes in. They didn't need my password. They didn't need my passcode. All they needed was a USB drive to pop into my computer and download anything that I left up there because I hadn't logged out. And because it's a 2-hour window, if I left at 5 o'clock and the office is a ghost town by 6 o'clock, cleaning crews in at 6:30, it's really easy. So when you think about vetting vendors, it's not just your banking relationship. It's not just your cloud provider. It's not your web designer. It's also who has access to your physical environment.
Awesome.
Then understanding what type of data is available: Social Security information, credit card, financial, passwords, medical records, travel information. You need to understand what data is out there, where could it be found, and who shouldn't have access to it. I go back to the merger transaction that I described to you, and they said, well, we didn't have an obligation to give notice because personally identifiable information wasn't involved. I will tell you that the state breach notification laws focus on PII and PHI, protected health information, primarily. Each state defines what PII is differently, but again, you have to look at your contracts. If you've got B2B contracts, look at the confidentiality clauses. What does your customer consider confidential? And Kristen, to your point, when you're entering into agreements with vendors, what are you defining as confidential that you expect your vendor to protect?
Right.
Again, I don't want to belabor the point. We've already gone down this, but look at the contracts. Look at what you've signed up for. Look at what you've committed to protect. And again, understanding where they are. Any place that your data exists, paper, electronic, or otherwise, that's where the information needs to be protected. Keep an inventory of what you have. Know what you've got. Know what computers you have. If people are working from home and on personal devices, know what that is. Know whose data you've got. Have your customer list. Have your personnel list, your suppliers, and who are you supplying to? Because again, if you don't know what you're protecting and you don't know where it is, it's going to be very difficult to manage the risk that's associated with those assets. Then we get into the next step, assessing risk. Now, for those of you who've done any type of risk management, whether it's cyber, whether it's project risk management, whether it's preparing for another, God forbid, Hurricane Superstorm Sandy, whether it's preparing for, God forbid, another pandemic, you identify your risks and then you rate them. And then ideally, you come up with a score. And then you think about, okay, what are my pain points? How much risk am I willing to tolerate? Now, when we think about cybersecurity and data protection, this slide, and I don't know how legible it is for you guys or not, but so for example, one of the things it says is DDoS, and that's denial of service attacks. Denial of service attacks will target emails. And what will happen is that a bad actor will get into an email system and flood it with junk email. And it may be just to force your server to shut down, or it may be to hide the delivery of malware. Either way, you need to think about, if my system got hit with a denial of service attack, what risks does that present to my business? If I have a box of medical records sitting in my office because I'm a billing service provider and that gets stolen, what risk does that present? Now, often these types of risk assessments will be done with a two-pronged team. So I've done risk assessments on the non-technical side. One of my clients is a water purveyor, which is a fancy way of saying water system, whether it's American Water, whether it's your local utility, whatever it is. And I did the non-technical risk assessment for them. So what I did was I went down to the facility, and first I interviewed their personnel. I asked them, how do you get into the company's systems? How do you access customer accounts? How are payments processed? How do visitors come into the facility? Is there a log? Do they have badges? Do they wear ID? Where are the servers? Where are backup servers? Are customer accounts kept electronically or in paper? And then again, remember, we're talking about a water purveyor. How is the reservoir protected? Are there security cameras? Where are the security cameras? Are the security cameras working? All of those things go into what I would think of as the non-technical risk assessment. The technical risk assessment, and some of you may have heard about pen tests, you may have heard about a risk matrix or a risk report that somebody receives after having done a technical risk assessment. What you would do is you would bring in a technology expert, and they would literally try to break into your system or do a penetration test or pen test. They would also assess your endpoints. They would assess whether you have a public Wi-Fi access within your system. And then what they would do is they would provide you a report. And the report would, in their mind, identify high risk, medium risk, low risk, and lay out what those risks are and how they could be resolved, mitigated, remediated. No matter how you do it, you want to make sure that you are doing at least once annually. And depending upon the type of business that you're in, maybe more frequently. Again, when we're thinking about risk assessment, you're looking to understand not just your systems, but your physical environment, your electronic assets, your website. Is your website vulnerable? And again, vendors. Do they have eyes into your system? And think about this. So back in the 90s, and I am that old, I was writing contracts for software licensing. And the software was primarily on premises at the time. And when we say on premises versus cloud, it means it's installed within your environment. You're not going into the cloud to get access to software. It's sitting on your computers. And if, God forbid, the software wasn't functioning properly, you would want the software vendor to remote in immediately, fix it now, I need it working. And so what you would have would be open ports so that the software vendor could remote in and take care of it. Well, I'll tell you, in this day and age, you don't want open ports. You don't want a third party to have eyes into your system without you knowing that they're coming in. So what we do at my firm is that we will only provide a vendor like that access on an as needed basis. So let's suppose that Christian was maintaining my software environment for me and something wasn't working right. So I call up Christian and I say, Christian, help. It's not doing what it's supposed to do. And Christian would say, okay, give me access credentials. Yeah. I call up my IT department. They give Christian access credentials. He does this thing, Christian's out, and those credentials are then deactivated. Those are the types of things that you want to think about when we're assessing where are our vulnerabilities. And when we think about a remotely working workforce, where are the vulnerabilities in their homes? I live at home with my husband and my dog. To my knowledge, my dog is not computer savvy, and my husband, I assure you, doesn't really want to know what my clients are doing. But let's suppose that I live in a house with 5 friends, and one of them happens to be a day trader. It might be really interesting for somebody like that to know that one of my clients is selling itself, or that it's about to do an IPO. That's valuable information. And now let's suppose that you're getting out and about these days and you decide you want to go get a Starbucks and you're working in Starbucks. People working around you might be very interested to know what you're doing. I'll tell you, I just flew down to Florida. Yes, I actually went to Florida a few weeks ago. We were masked on the plane, but because of what I do, I'm that kind of person that I look around me in the airport. What's that person doing? What's that person doing? And it doesn't have to be just on the computer. And in fact, I don't work on my laptop in an airport, and I don't work on a laptop in a plane. If I need to review a contract, it's in paper. And I'm reviewing it on paper, and I'm making notes on it so that somebody can't use public Wi-Fi that I might have been logged into, even though I shouldn't be, to access what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. And worse yet, if I'm using the wrong public Wi-Fi. I think it's Dunkin' Donuts. I think it's United. And in fact, it's somebody else who spoofed that Wi-Fi. So be very circumspect when you think about your working remotely. And that's the type of risk you want to think about. When you have people coming back to the office, what have they done to clean up the paper trail, if you will, from working at home? Did they shred documents or did they throw it out in the garbage? And especially if you're in the financial industry, there's all sorts of rules and regulations as to what could be printed at home, if at all, and how it has to be disposed of. And if you've got clients who tell you, we want to know how you're disposing of information when you go back to the office, you better have an answer for them. Again, think about what the impact of a risk is. And the impact could be loss of time, loss of information, loss of productivity, credibility, identity. Identify what the impact of each risk is that you've identified and rate it. Is it going to crush my business, or is that hiccup that's just, you know what? So we have to go back old school. And in fact, when you think about software systems, oftentimes I'll ask my clients, when you're looking at a software, an SLA, a service level agreement with your software vendors, and you'll see the response time on an SLA will say, well, we'll get back to you in 30 minutes, or we'll get back to you in an hour. We'll get back to you in 2 business days. Well, if that's mission critical software, that's going to have big impact on you if it's not available. If it's software that, yeah, we had a paper way of doing things, and if it wasn't available, it'd be inconvenient, but I would live. It's that type of thing you want to think about. If you have a cyber event, if you have a loss of information, a loss of assets, can you keep functioning? How inconvenient, how disastrous is it? And understand what impact it will have on your business so that then you can respond appropriately to that risk.
What's the most common impact that you've seen? The most common type?
Well, and again, it depends on the type of risk that you're talking about, Christian. So if we're talking about the pandemic, I think that brought the type of risk that none of us foresaw. None of us foresaw walking out the door of our offices on, depending upon when your office shut down, March 16th, 2020, and leaving all the paper on your desk and having a cleaning crew that could see all the paper on your desk. That was a risk that nobody anticipated on March 1st. Nobody, unless of course you had out your crystal ball. Nobody was anticipating necessarily that everybody would be working on home devices that might not have firewalls.
Right.
But now that we know better, and this brings us to the end of our discussion later on, how do you recycle what you've learned? If you've had an event, if you've had an incident, what have you learned from it? To your point, Christian, what have you seen so that you can now anticipate? We know, for example, that wire fraud is common. We know that ransomware is out there. We know that phishing emails are out there. And when I say we know, because you read it in the news every single day, we know that people are going to get spoofed emails. I will tell you that I used to work in Tokyo. And because of that, it doesn't surprise me if I receive an email from somebody in Japan. But I'm still circumspect, because it could be the reason I'm getting the emails because somebody saw that I worked in Japan, because they looked at my LinkedIn profile, and now they'll see, well, she may not be surprised if she sees an email supposedly from a CEO with a Japanese company who's looking to collect on litigation here in the US. So Michelle, if she's not properly trained, is going to click on this email that I sent her. Email compromise, business email compromise, Christian, is probably the #1 threat to a small business owner. Clicking on those suspect links. And it's not necessarily on email alone. It could be on a text message. It could be vishing. It could be voicemail messages. In fact, I got a message on my cell phone the other day that was telling me, this is PSE&G and you haven't paid your bill and we will be shutting off your water unless you call us back and pay us immediately. But I happen to know for a fact that we have automatic bill pay. So I knew it was a false phone. But if you haven't trained your personnel to know that that's out there, they could fall for that. So yeah, I don't know if there's a one answer to that question, Christian, but there's definitely things that are out there. Obviously, ransomware is out there. By the way, I will tell you, obviously, I'm an attorney, but if I got bored with being an attorney, I could go be a bad guy tomorrow for a very little amount of money. And if you think I'm kidding, Christian, online, I could buy a ransomware kit for under $50. Now, the problem with me becoming a bad guy and buying ransom to launch is that I don't know what I'm doing, which means that I not only could hit you with ransomware, but even if you paid me the ransom, I may not be able to deliver the decryption key properly. So you would have paid me, and I'm
Okay.
not trying to screw you twice, but I might, because I don't know how to deploy the decryption key. These risks are out there. Oh, and by the way, there's also ransomware as a service, just as there's software as a service. So, Christian, you could pay me to be your bad actor. Those risks are out there. And you need to understand that as a small business owner, you are low-hanging fruit. You're an easy target, and the whole point of this discussion is to make you less attractive. In terms of how we respond to risk, that depends on the level of risk and your risk appetite. So we could avoid risk, we could mitigate it, remediate it, share or shift it.
Hello, hello. Testing, testing. Seems like we lost Michelle for a sec. Testing, testing. Well, in the meantime, while we see what's going on, hopefully it's not a cyber threat to douche. But I really don't, right? It could, you know, God forbid. But let me know in the chat. Do you guys have any questions so far up to this point of the presentation? Awesome. Well, we got, there we go.
I have no idea what just happened to my home internet. Speaking of risks, and
that's exactly what I told our audience. Hopefully it wasn't a cyber attack.
But again, I had a backup plan. I had my cell phone and I had my slides printed out.
Awesome.
I had risk response ready to rock and roll.
Perfect
and
example.
I couldn't have planned a better, Christian, if I tried. Yeah. Now, the only downside, of course, is that you're all going to have to listen to me now without my slide deck. So I do apologize for that, Christian, unless you want to call up the slide deck. But
no, yeah, I can actually. You'll have to give me a couple secs to pull that up and find it. But I can, yes, absolutely.
And while you do that, let me share with you again, how do we respond to risk? So avoidance. One of my clients was doing business with Bear. And as you can imagine, it was a small business owner. Bear is the 600-pound gorilla. And Bear gave them a contract that had 4 pages dedicated to cybersecurity and incident response. And it included unlimited liability for my client's small business owner. Oh, and by the way, they wanted them to have at least $10 million in cyber insurance, which I assure you my client couldn't afford. And the client said to me, what do I do with this? And my answer was, it depends. And they said, what do you mean it depends? I said, how badly do you want the business? Can you afford unlimited liability? Are they paying you enough for you to be their insurance carrier? And if the answer is no, then the answer is avoid the risk and don't sign the contract.
Awesome. So Michelle, our webinar assistant, GloryMed, was able to pull it up. So you'll just have to, you know, let her know when you want to switch slides. But I believe we ended here.
Slide right now, please. Can we move to the next slide, please? Keep going. Perfect. Oh, there we go. So mitigation. When we think about mitigation, we're talking about controls. If I lost power, how do I mitigate that risk? I mitigate that risk by having my cell phone handy with a Wi-Fi connection. I have my PowerPoint printed out so I can refer to it. I have a backup plan. How do you reduce risk? You reduce risk with more robust passwords. You reduce risk with multi-factor authentication, with encryption. It depends on the risk and how you respond to it, but you also can remediate risk. If you're concerned that you have leased equipment that has information, you reduce or remediate that risk by wiping the data from that equipment before you return it. So keep that in mind when we think about how we respond to risk. What's the risk? What's my risk appetite? And what type of controls can I put into place to either reduce the risk or to eliminate it completely. I could also shift that risk. I could shift it by going to a cloud provider. And by the way, cloud is not a dirty word if properly vetted, or I could shift it to insurance. But keep in mind that insurance shifting is reactive, not proactive. So if you're shifting your risk by buying cyber insurance, you're assuming something's already happened. And then you could choose to accept the risk. So going back to the example of negotiating the contract with Bear for my small client, if the contract's big enough, yeah, you may accept that liability nut. That's a business decision, but you want it to be an educated decision. If we can go to the next slide, that would be helpful. I want to show you this concept of imputed knowledge of risks. This is something that we're seeing more and more in enforcement actions. And what this is talking about is what you as a small business owner can say with a straight face, I didn't know. Several years ago, the IRS shared a known scam. Christian, you asked what type of scams are out there?
Yeah.
A known scam is an email sent. So again, Christian, you and I now work together. You and I are both in the HR department, and you're my boss. I get an email from you, ostensibly, at 4:45 on a Friday. My friends are waiting at the bar. Bars are still open. It's happy hour. And you say, we're having a Department of Labor audit on Monday. I need everybody's W-2s. Now, after I'm done cursing out Christian for sending me an email like that on a Friday afternoon, I still want to be a good worker bee. So I gather the file together, I hit send, and off I go. Monday morning, we all come to work, and I say to Christian, how else can I help you with the Department of Labor audit? And Christian says to me, what Department of Labor audit? That is a known scam. The IRS alerted the community back in 2015. The Society of Human Resources Professionals alerted its community in 2016. And there have been multiple pieces of litigation about that scam. As a small business owner, you cannot say, I didn't know that was a risk. And so if the God forbid happens, and somebody says you didn't take reasonable measures to mitigate that risk or to remediate that risk, you cannot say, I didn't know. Now, there are some things that you may not know. There are some things that as a small business owner, it's not reasonable to expect you to know. But if something's out there and repeated, ransomware attacks, multi-factor authentication, encryption, if you've heard these things, you know about these things, you can't say when somebody says, hey, how come you didn't prepare? You should have known. I didn't know is not an answer. Now, if we can go to the next slide, if you do this risk assessment, what you want to do then is have a risk register. You've identified the risk, what's caused the risk, when was it identified, what's the impact on my business, how have I rated it, and who in my business owns that risk. And when I say who owns that risk, who's going to be responsible for the remediation, mitigation, or monitoring of that risk, and what's the status. So think about the Microsoft Exchange compromise several months ago. That was a risk, and in fact, it was an event that impacted a lot of small businesses. If I were entering that on my risk register, that would have been probably a risk rating of 10 if we're using 0 to 10, with 10 being the highest. How that was going to be remediated would be a very complicated process. But if I have something like a risk register that's tracking it, and I have somebody who's accountable for this, and then a regulator comes in or my client comes in and says, how are you dealing with this? I now have a paper trail that says that I'm acting responsibly to respond to risk. Now, when we think about mitigation and protection against risk, let's go to the next slide. And there's some basic things like antivirus software, firewalls, passwords, multi-factor authentication, encryption, upgrades, patches. Think about your workforce. A lot of small business owners have employees working on their own devices. My firm has us all working on company issued devices. And because we're working on company issued devices, my firm can push out patches to everybody at the same time. Patching is critical. If you can't control when your people are patching their devices, you need to have them be accountable. Christian, did you patch that software?
So quick question, what is patching?
Okay, so we have personal devices, cell phones, laptops, tablets, blah, blah, blah. And you probably get notes from time to time from my cell phone's a Samsung. Let's suppose that you have an Apple phone, what have you. You'll get an alert that says there's an upgrade available, or there's something. Well, more often than not, those upgrades are a euphemism for we've discovered a vulnerability. We did an assessment and we found that there was a problem with this part of our operating system or our device. And we've developed a patch to protect against that exploit being used to compromise you. Therefore, we're pushing out a patch to our users. Patches are inconvenient. It takes a few minutes to install them. And you'll get an alert that says, install now or remind me later. If you're hitting remind me later, you're leaving that back door open. You're leaving it an opportunity and a risk waiting to happen and waiting to be exploited. So you want to make sure if your people are working on personal devices that they are patching them, they're keeping them upgraded. So if you're running, and I apologize, let's suppose that it was, I don't know, Windows 7, which I think has been retired. If you're still running Windows 7, Microsoft maybe not be supporting that anymore. They're not even pushing out patches anymore because now Windows 10 is available. If you're running old software, if you're running old systems, there isn't an upgrade available for it. And it is vulnerable. Now, I went to a presentation for small businesses at the FBI several years ago, and they were talking about what small business owners should have in place. And they mentioned antivirus software, and they mentioned firewalls, and they mentioned passwords, and they mentioned two-factor authentication, and they didn't mention encryption. So at the end of the presentation, I raised my hand and I said, well, what about encryption? And they said, oh, well, that's intuitively obvious. And I just shook my head and I said,
no, it's not.
Exactly. I said, how many small business owners have you actually worked with to think that it's intuitively obvious to a small business owner that they should have systems encrypted? Now, I will tell you that depending upon the systems that you as small business owners are using, the odds are good that you do have an encryption solution available. Some are free, some are not. Typically, what you'll have available for free is 128-bit encryption. That's pretty good, but it's not best in class. Right now, what's considered best is 256-bit, and you may have to pay for the 256-bit encryption solution. I would encourage you, pay that extra money to have the better protection. Passwords should not be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It shouldn't be QWERTY. And you don't want to use the same password across multiple devices or multiple accounts. And if your password's been compromised on one system, assume it's been compromised elsewhere, because people will assume that you are a creature of habit and make the passwords complex. So Christian, you mentioned that is it LastPass that you're using now?
Yes, I use lastpass.com.
Now, I am solution agnostic, so I'm not promoting LastPass, Dashlane, or anything else. But what I'm telling you is that if you don't have a ridiculously good memory, which I do, I'm happy to say, then use something that will come up with robust passwords for you, or that will store passwords for you, and that device is secure. And again, make sure that when personnel leave your business, that their credentials are turned off. That's mitigation. If you've got somebody who's on disability, their credentials should not be active, because by the way, they're not supposed to be working if they're on disability.
Yeah, quick note on that. I have several VAs that are overseas, and that's obviously a huge risk if they're still in I have access to any of my documents. So I have an offboarding. So I don't just have an onboarding SOPs, standard operating procedures, but I have an offboarding, and part of that is removing them from all those systems.
Good for you, Christian. And by the way, what Christian just described is a policy or a procedure, and it should be written because you want to document what you're doing. If you have a compromise and a regulator come in and says, well, what did you do to prepare? What was your roadmap? You want to be able to point to those SOPs, and you shouldn't be fumbling around and saying, oh, I think it's here somewhere. You want to have a binder that's printed out and that contains all of those SOPs along the lines of what Christian just described. I'm going to ask you now to please skip one slide and go to the next slide.
We have about 8 minutes total, by the way, Michelle.
Thank you. So again, when we think about how we respond to risk, there's different ways. And again, for a small business owner, Rome was not built in a day. But think about these different things that you can do. Clean desk policy, locking doors, having monitors log off, not 2 hours.
We're having some trouble hearing you, Michelle. It's a little bit
drives
choppy.
coming in from a client.
There we go. I think we're catching up now.
Okay. When we think about USB drives, if somebody sends to you a USB drive with information, don't put it into a connected system. Put it into a standalone device, because if God forbid there's malware on that USB drive and you put it into your systems, you've just now launched that malware into your entire environment.
How about those free USB drives that you get at networking events?
Well, Christian, you know from one of my prior presentations, you
Yeah.
should not trust those. So several years ago, there was an ADA convention. All the dentists got together, and part of the presentation was that the codes were changing. So instead of root canal being coded as a 1, 2, 3, 4, it was now going to be coded as an A, B, C, D. And all the dentists and all their office administrators are groaning, because now you have to go back and reprogram how you're going to be putting in those procedures to get insurance or anything else. And the ADA said, no, don't worry. We're having your packets, USB drives that have all the codes available. And everybody says, oh, phew, thank goodness. The first dentist goes back, plugs the USB drive into their device, and call up the ADA and say, what did you do to me? The USB drives had been sourced from China, and the manufacturer in China had preloaded malware onto the USB drive. And by putting that USB drive into the dentist's office system, now the entire system was infected and exposed. Now, I'm going to ask you to jump forward a couple of slides to me, and I want to get to the slide that shows a picture of 2 people pinky swearing to each other. Now, a critical component of, I like the, oh my God, thank you so much. The whole point of these programs is to help you become aware of these things, to understand what's out there so that you can have a plan, so you can respond, and you can train personnel what to look for. Take the slide deck and share it with your folks. Do an internal lunch and learn. Do a Zoom session. Make them watch Christian and me talking to each other. Make your folks aware of what they should be looking for. So several years ago, I got an email from an attorney at another law firm here in New Jersey. I happen to know several folks at this firm. I didn't know this particular attorney. And it said, please see this proposal and then call me. Because of what I do, I'm circumspect, and I say, I don't know who he is. I wasn't expecting a proposal. So I go online, I look up the firm's website, I look up the email for this particular attorney, and I send him an email to his known email address and say, hi, did you send me a proposal? What's this all about? I get an email responding to my email that I sent to the known email address that says, yes, I sent you the proposal. Please take a look. I look forward to hearing from you. But I also left him a phone message. I called him at his known phone number and I said, I got this email from you. Before I open up the proposal, is this from you? So when I got the email back, again, me being paranoid, I didn't click on it. 2 hours later, I got a phone call from him. He said, thank you so much for calling. I didn't know somebody had gotten into our email system and they had inserted a rule that was redirecting his email. So when I sent my confirming email, I got back a legitimate email that was from his email address, but a bad actor had gotten into their system they didn't know. So training your personnel and telling them to pick up the phone is the #1 most cost-effective way to avoid and mitigate risk. Now, I'm going to ask you to go forward a couple of slides to a slide that shows a note from Stacy. There we are. This is something that could come not by email, but by a text. So with Facebook and LinkedIn and social media, long lost friends from elementary school are cropping up all over the place. Well, you think it's your long lost friend, but maybe it's a bad actor who wants you to click on a suspect link. And now you think, oh, this is going to be fun. Stacy sent me pictures from kindergarten. And you click on the link and then have that lovely, pardon my French, oh shit moment.
Yeah.
These are the things that you need to be aware of, you need to prepare for, and you want to train your personnel to understand what not to click on. And I'm going to ask you to go forward a couple more slides to one that says passwords at the top. There, up, back 2, please. One more, perfect. Again, you want them to be aware because people are working remotely, working at home, on a plane, on a train. I sound like a John Candy movie. Make sure that you know where your people are working and have them understand what risks they're exposed to because of their potential situations. Now, what I want you to do, again, at your leisure, is look at several of these slides that we're going to skip over because they'll give you an idea of some other risks that are out there. And what I want to jump to is a slide that says at the top, risk shifting and cloud providers. Christian, you mentioned earlier in our discussion, how do you deal with third parties? And the way that you deal with third parties is to vet them. The same things that we're talking about in terms of your environment and assessing your risk, you need to ask the same question of your third parties. Are they doing risk assessments? If they're managing your credit card payments, are they PCI compliant? Have they done SOC assessments? Now, some of you may have heard about SOC reports, and I'll tell you that not all SOC reports are created equal in the sense that, first of all, there's a SOC 1 and a SOC 2. A SOC 1 is for financial controls. A SOC 2 is for technical controls, the type of things that we're talking about, passwords, encryptions, risk assessments, training personnel, what have you. And a SOC 2 type 1 looks only at a window in time. What you want to see from your vendors is a SOC 2 type 2, which will look at, for example, an entire year. Did they keep these controls in place for an entire year consistently? And did they do a risk assessment? And if so, what did that risk assessment show? Because oftentimes what you see with these SOC reports is at the end, they will have responded to a risk identified in the SOC report and how they responded to that risk. Now, I want to again go forward a few more slides to where you'll see a vendor tracking program slide. There we are. So just like we have a risk register, this vendor tracking program helps you to keep track of your vendors. So let's suppose that I want to hire Christian. First, I'm going to kick his tires and I'm going to say, do I really want to hire Christian? And if I'm hiring him, what type of data is he going to be touching? Have I seen his SOC report? Am I satisfied with what I've seen? Does he have cyber insurance? Does he have crime coverage? And if I'm going to go forward with him, what does my contract look like? Is he going to indemnify me if, God forbid, he's compromised? Because, by the way, when you think about business interruption, and I'll go back, think about Superstorm Sandy, and you think about business interruption from that type of event, that's not the same as business interruption from a cyber event. Does Christian have that type of insurance to protect me if he has an incident? And then if I hire Christian, I then want to keep track of that because your risk assessment of your vendors is not a one and done. It should be annual. And going back to Christian's offboarding of personnel, you want to offboard vendors too. If they've touched your data, how do you know they're no longer keeping your data? So it's a vendor life cycle. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that I've given you some robust, meaty slides on cyber insurance and risk assessments. So what I'm not going to do, because I know we are at the end of our formal presentation time, is go through all of my slides that go on and on and on and on and on about cyber insurance. What I will tell you is when you talk to your insurance carrier, make sure, or I'm sorry, your insurance broker, they know what they're talking about. A lot of insurance brokers claim to know cyber insurance and they don't. So one of my small clients, 4-person accounting firm, 4 part-time employees, was hit with a cyber attack. And the first question I asked him was, do you have cyber insurance? And his answer was, I think so. When we looked at his policy, he had a $50,000 policy with a $25,000 deductible slapped onto his professional liability insurance. It was useless, because I will tell you right now that incident response is not cheap. His dollars spent on the total spend, not only to address the incident, contain it, notify his impacted clients, and recover, was over $200,000. The $50,000 policy that he purchased was useless. So if your agent says, oh yeah, I've got you covered, find another agent who's going to go into the detail that you're going to see on the slides when you look at them afterwards. Now, the last thing that I want to touch on quickly, because I know that we are at the end of time, is there's a slide with 3 people holding hands. So if we can find that slide, keep going, please. Almost there. Told you there was a lot on cyber insurance. There we go. You need to have your team. And I go back to my handy dandy little incident card that I showed you earlier. On that card lists our team players and their points of contact. And when you think about your incident response, think about not only internal resources, but external resources. Who's your legal resource? Who's your HR resource? And who's your media resource? Because you're going to have to spin this message, and you want to spin it in the most positive light possible. When these things happen, you want to respond effectively, and you want to be able to recover. So I know I've pushed the time limit here, Christian, on our formal time frame, and I think we have some questions. So do we want to turn to the questions and whatever may be lurking in the chat and try to go through those?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to go back to my screen here. But one of the questions is, I was told not to use LastPass on the same device I am using because it can be compromised. Is that true?
I am paranoid about everything online. And Christian asked me earlier, should I access a software package through another package? So for example, if he was on his Google account, should he be accessing another software there? And if the purpose is to protect one system from another, then I would say, yeah, I would divide and conquer as much as possible when it comes to different accounts. And again, when we think about accounts, think about your Facebook account, think about your LinkedIn account, think about your banking account. Don't have them all mushed together. And when your Gmail account asks you, do you want me to remember this password? Do you want me to remember you? The answer is no. Don't let them remember it for you. Keep it someplace else.
Awesome. Next question is, what is your company contact info? I'll need a consultant.
Yeah. I think we have that after this slide.
No, not your information. Would you want to go back? You can go back to your slides also.
It was at the end.
Okay.
And certainly, by the way, guys, you can always contact me through the SBDC. I am an SBDC consultant.
I actually do have yours here.
So if we can go to towards the end of this slide deck.
Assuming it's this one.
Keep scrolling down. Whoops. Go back up once more. Whoops. Then we had it a minute ago.
That one.
There we go. So
okay, there we go. There we go.
With my law firm. And by the way, I post on LinkedIn all the time. And actually, can we go back one page earlier?
Sure.
Guys, please, 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 when we're done, look at these resources. These are free resources that will give you the types of templates that we're talking about. They'll give you the roadmaps that we've been talking about. So for example, at the very end of this list is Sans Institute. Sans has samples of playbooks, of password policies, of software onboarding policies, of personnel onboard policies. But don't just print them out and adopt them. Use them and modify them to what you're actually doing. So Christian, as we go through any more questions, let's keep this page up for the audience.
Awesome. All right. So let's see. Is there a need of cyber liability insurance for small businesses? What are some providers or good resources you can recommend?
So again, if you have a knowledgeable broker, they should be a good resource for you. Now, I will tell you that a lot of the insurance carriers have started to back off of cyber insurance because they are concerned that the premiums may or may not be worth the potential exposure they have with ransomware on the rise, what have you. That said, it also, and I'll sound like a lawyer, it depends on what your contracts require. So for example, one of my clients is a women-owned, minority-owned business, and she was pitching to a major utility. And the utility wanted to hire minority-owned and women-owned business. But the utility was also requiring contractually for her to have $10 million in cyber insurance. She said to me, Michelle, I don't have $10 million in cyber insurance, and I can't afford $10 million in cyber insurance. And I said, well, it's really simple. Go back to the utility and say, look, you guys have an initiative in place. You want to hire women-owned businesses. You want to hire minority-owned businesses. You want to hire small business owners. But for us to work together and you have the comfort that you need, can we share the cost of the premium if I'm going to get you that $10 million policy? And maybe because of the type of data I'm touching, maybe the policy I should have only needs to be $5 million. So in terms of whether you need it or not, I would definitely recommend that you at least look into it. And in terms of how much you need, it depends on what type of business you're in. So if you're B2B, then the type of information you may have from a personally identifiable information standpoint is probably limited mostly to your personnel's information. But think about the bear contract example that I shared, where my client was dealing obviously with a business, and they were being asked to assume unlimited liability and give an indemnification. If you're giving an indemnity, you better have insurance standing behind it. Because I'll tell you, if I'm negotiating that contract, I know that indemnity is worth the paper it's written on, unless there's insurance standing behind it.
Very great. No. I believe we have, no, I think that is all questions that we have here. So how can people connect with you, Michelle?
Again, I would encourage you to get in touch with me through the SBDC. In fact, I believe that the SBDC would prefer you to get in touch with me. I would also encourage you to take a look at what I post on LinkedIn. In fact, I'm going to be posting this week about my favorite annual thing to post about, which is my birthday. And what drives me crazy
Happy
is,
birthday.
well, thank you very much. It was earlier in the month. And what drives me crazy is how many birthday wishes I get from folks who, why do you still have my information? Now, I would tell you that I'm in my 50s. I have no qualms about how old I am. I'd like to think that I'm reasonably well preserved. And I graduated college a long time ago. So explain to me, why does my college still wish me happy birthday? For that matter, why does my dry cleaner wish me happy birthday? Why do these people have my digits? And you really need to think about who's got your stuff and where. And when I post on LinkedIn, I post this type of information for both individuals and for business owners. Now, one of the other resources that's on here is the NJKIC, that is the New Jersey Cybersecurity and Communication Information Cell. NJKIC is a free resource for small business owners. And they put out every Thursday, today is Thursday, so they will put out a weekly report of the latest and greatest that's coming up in the business community in New Jersey. So if there's a flavor of ransomware you need to worry about, if there's a patch that's available, and by the way, Microsoft has Patch Tuesday. So if you're using Microsoft products, look for patches on Tuesdays. These are things you should be looking for. And again, to reach out to me, you can do it through SBDC, you can do it through LinkedIn, you can do it through my law firm. And you're asking me how to spell that. If you're asking how to spell the NJ Kick, actually it's on this slide, I believe.
Yep.
The website for it. It's www, and I can't read it because it's small on my cell phone screen. But once you get the slide deck, you'll see the link to access NJ Kick. And by the way, don't try to spell my law firm name. You can't. It's www.csglaw.com.
Awesome. All right. All right. So as always, thank you so much, Michelle, for a wonderful presentation. For everyone in the audience, our next event's going to be with Melanie Willoughby, Executive Director at the NJBAC, and we're going to talk about small business resources available. That's it for us. Remember, we are the NJSBDC. We've helped 13,000 small businesses grow in New Jersey. So if you want to get started, if you want to contact Michelle, register at njsbdc.com/request-counseling. That's it for us. Thank you so much, Michelle, once again. And we will see everyone next week, Thursday. Bye, everyone.
Stay well, everyone, and stay secure.
Thank you.